Hi, I'm Simon Phipps, and I'm going to talk to you about something that I call the rights ratchet model. The rights ratchet model is an approach to the monetization of open source that dates back to the primordial days of the beginnings of the open source movement. Some of the earliest projects evolved this model for monetization. I call it rights ratchet because in the process of the life cycle of one of your upstream components or tools, you'll discover that your rights under open source to use, study, modify, and improve and share the code are gradually eroded to the point where they go away completely. So that's why this talk is called the rights ratchet model. Bait and switch meets boiling frogs. It's kind of the bait and switch business model and the boiling frogs social encounter where you raise the heat so slowly that the frog doesn't realize that it is dinner and not a guest until things are too late. I'm going to tell you the story of the journey of an open source pioneer. Now, right back at the beginning of the open source movement, open source focused very much on the desktop. It was very much a mano with Microsoft. And so replacing Microsoft's desktop was very important. And open source was very much about the replacement of commercial off-the-shelf software. And by the beginning of the 2000s, people were beginning to realize that the larger enterprise systems could also be replaced by open source. And in 2004, a group of colleagues formed a company called Sugar CRM to create an open source customer relationship management project. And they licensed it as an open source project under the Mozilla license, plus some extra clauses to make sure they got attribution. I pretty much consider that to be an OSI licensing model. They've simply clarified what they mean by attribution. The company was VC funded. They had about £2 million fed into the company from a friend, and they used what you might call an open core business model, adding commercial capabilities to their subscribers' software that weren't available in the open source version. The open source version was called Sugar Open Source, and it was very popular indeed, very rapidly adopted. There were 25,000 downloads in the first year, and it was very widely used, particularly for small or smaller nonprofits. It was also used by small businesses, and it gained so many users that by 2006, they had a large enough user base to have a conference that was called SugarCon. SugarCon went on to drive growth for the Sugar product range of both Sugar Open Source and its adoption, and of Sugar Professional, the paid-for version. In 2007, the first warning signs that this was actually a rights ratchet and not a genuine open source community began to emerge. The open source version was rebranded Sugar Community Edition, and it was relicensed under the GPL v3 open source license. Quite a different proposition to the Mozilla license, which is a very relaxed file-based copyleft. The GPL is, of course, well known to be a much stronger copyleft package. The Mozilla license in the original project was quite important, though, because being a copyleft license, it meant that it was necessary, theoretically, to have a contributor agreement. And so having a contributor agreement meant that Sugar was able to relicense to GPL v3 in 2007. The move to GPL v3 obviously gave confidence to VCs, because in 2008, $20 million was invested in Sugar CRM. And at the same time, 2 of the 3 founders left the company. The board brought in a new CEO in the form of the very lovely Larry Augustin. Larry was one of the founders of the open source movement in many ways. He was involved in many of the discussions about the coining of the term open source, and his thinking was very instrumental in forming open source. And you might see his appointment as CEO as a sugarcoating to the otherwise unacceptable behavior that Sugar was preparing for, because in 2010 they began to remove features from Sugar CE, that's the rebranded open source edition, and they also relicensed it again, this time under AGPL v3. AGPL, that's the Affero GPL, is a license that, as you know, is intended to transmit the copyleft effect even to network deployment of software. And that was a foreshadowing of the intent of Sugar 7 to be a software as a service, Sugar CRM. And Sugar 7 had no open source counterpart. So if you wanted to install a CRM yourself, you had to use the defeatured version of Sugar version 6. In 2014, as had really become obvious, Sugar announced that version 6.5 of Sugar CE would be the last open source release. And then in 2018, the final click of the ratchet came along, and Sugar attempted to remove all trace of the community edition from sourceforge.net and from the internet. They weren't completely successful. There were other forks because people had had plenty of time to get ready for that. So this went from 2004 to 2018, 14 years of progress on the project. And there were plenty of signs while it was going on that there was going to be a problem if you had eyes to see them. To do that, you had to recognize the rights ratchet model. Now, what do I mean by the rights ratchet model? What I mean by the rights ratchet model is that a company creates an open source project, and at its inception, they focus hard on open source. The reason they do that is because they want to drive adoption of their technology. So they'll use a license that makes it very easy for their target audience to adopt the software. If they're targeting end users, they'll probably be using a weak copyleft license. If they're using, if they're targeting developers, they'll probably use something like the Apache license for the project. But throughout that open source adoption phase of their life cycle, they will explain how important it is for them to have a copyright assignment. Maybe they'll appeal to your desire for fairness. Maybe they'll talk about patent protection. Maybe they'll talk about other things that sound good to you, but they'll be focused on making sure that they uniquely in the community have the rights to the full copyright of the product. Then as life goes on, you'll hear the messaging changing. You'll hear them talking about community much more than about open source. And that shift to a community emphasis is accompanied by more and more effort at community management and customer onboarding. And as time goes by, gradually, people who are not partners of the company will be treated as non-contributors, and they will gradually have their rights removed. So the license will gradually be made more hostile to business models that rely on access on the free availability of the source code. They will begin to talk about the perils of their software being run without payment on cloud hosting services. And so you've seen exactly this happening with companies like Elastic, MongoDB, and Redis Labs, who have all blamed AWS for what actually was their inevitable removal of rights and drift towards proprietary. At the bottom of this slide, there's a link to my blog post about Elastic's move to gradually remove rights, which I believe was completely predictable and honestly in no way related to AWS. I'd be willing to argue the case, but I think that they would have removed those rights for some excuse, even in the absence of the existence of AWS. At the end of the cycle, the product will go proprietary. They may leave the open source version available somewhere. They may exit through acquisition and let the acquiring company let the open source version fall fallow. They may let all the original people involved in the project leave and let the new owners confuse and abandon the open source version. All of those things have happened. So for example, I used to work at ForgeRock, and ForgeRock has taken that path of allowing indistinct confusion over what's open source and what's proprietary to basically make them a proprietary only package. You've also seen companies like Oracle simply walk away from communities where they have a proprietary version. So the end of the rights ratchet can be to go proprietary and remain in business. It can be to exit to an acquirer. It can be to slowly shift business models so that open source is not available. The result of all this for you is that you'll discover that you are no longer able to exercise your software freedoms. And that can mean that you can't maintain the code effectively. It can mean that you are stuck with a very expensive and complex migration to a competing or alternative package. Whatever it means, it will almost certainly mean you spending money to solve the problem that's caused. So it's worth spotting early on, and it's worth understanding when your upstream supplier is actually treating you as one of the pods in the matrix rather than as a community peer. So the rights ratchet model gradually clicks along. I call it the ratchet model because it goes one click at a time. You see a thing happening, and that's your indication that gradually the ratchet is turning, and you're gradually being turned from a community peer into a revenue source. At the beginning, the earliest sign of all this is a focus on adoption rather than collaboration. Open source projects want collaborators because the collaborators will work in their own space, innovate in ways the original developers did not anticipate. They will fix bugs and contribute elegant solutions to problems, and they will generally improve the quality of the code for everyone. On the other hand, a rights ratchet company will probably employ all the developers and so won't care very much about collaboration. What they'll care about will be adoption, because they will want to drive adoption to become the default or the preferred or the critically acclaimed version of the software in their space, so that they're then able to capture leads and convert those into paying customers. Typically, a rights ratchet product will have a contributor agreement. Now, contributor agreements have been controversial from the very beginning, and contributor agreements are used in environments like the Apache Software Foundation and by the FSF, and one can argue that they are less harmful in those environments. However, I believe that the Apache Software Foundation's unnecessary contributor license agreements, I say that unnecessary because I believe the Apache license conveys all the rights necessary for an Apache project to be used by all of its community. That unnecessary use of a CLA has socialized the use of a CLA with the Apache license. And so when companies using the rights ratchet model use the Apache license, they're able to justify their use of the Apache CLA alongside the Apache license. It's really not necessary for any purpose other than to aggregate all of the rights in the software for later. The most important part of having a contributor agreement for a rights ratchet company is actually not about changing the license. It is actually about not having to comply with the license themselves. The company at the heart of a rights ratchet model will want to uniquely be the one company that doesn't have to comply with the license. And they need a contributor agreement and the allocation of either the copyright or rights equivalent to the ownership of the copyright in moral rights countries, so that they are able to do their own thing and not necessarily comply with the license. This will often be the basis on which they offer software as a service in a way that no competitor could. So this isn't just about changing licenses or making third-party agreements with other companies. It can be fundamental to the delivery of service for these companies. You'll find that fairly early in the life cycle of a rights ratchet company, there'll be a differentiated alternative, which is created as the main revenue source for the company. This is not all bad. A differentiated alternative is quite a good thing in many cases. I tend to feel that if the differentiation is coexistence with proprietary software, it's probably okay for that differentiation to also be proprietary. So if you need a connector to your Oracle database, probably having that connector be a for-fee extra is perfectly valid, because you've chosen to use a proprietary database. So why should you not also pay for a proprietary connector? If, however, the differentiated alternative contains all of the important features to be able to routinely use the software, as Sugar CRM's Community Edition did after version 6 had removed the key features, then you can tell that there is something that is a bit ratchety going on. You heard the click of a ratchet in the background. Open source code often becomes a free trial version. Often the word free is emphasized, and the idea of using it for an evaluation period becomes dominant. You often find the source code disappears behind a registration form. You often find that the binary code disappears behind a registration form, and the links to the source code repository and to the community can be quite difficult to find in Rights Ratchet websites. As all these things are going on, you'll often hear assertive rhetoric claiming that the company is being as open as it reasonably possibly can and imploring you to consider the fairness and the need for monetization. That rhetoric often likes to blame somebody for something. So again, you heard Mongo and Redis Labs and Cockroach and Elastic all blaming AWS for their need to go proprietary, even though I think none of those companies was showing any revenue impact from the existence of AWS. All they were actually seeing was an inability to capture the market in other countries where the hosting providers were not AWS. Associated with the contributor agreement and the strong rhetoric and the free trial version, you'll often find the license gets changed along the ratchet for reasons that don't benefit the community, only benefit the central company. So not to update the license from Eclipse 1 to Eclipse 2, for example, but as you saw Sugar CRM doing, move from Mozilla to GPL v3 to AGPL. And that kind of a trajectory is quite characteristic of a rights ratchet. At the end of the ratchet, you'll find the community is no longer particularly recognized. There's probably no realistic way to see what bugs there are in the software. The bug tracker is not public. You'll probably find the documentation has been copyrighted and made proprietary. You'll probably find that both of those things happened before the license was changed that actually took the software proprietary, so that even if you were able to fork the code, you were unable to fork the DevOps that were necessary to sustain the code at the level where it was located. Meaning that if you did try to create a fork, you might have the source code, but you'd have to reconstruct the DevOps and reconstruct the documentation. And those changes are slow clicks that happen in the background, but they are associated with that last step in counting the clicks. You can spot all of these things happening, and I wrote a blog post about it that you see the URL for on the screen there, a kind of a scorecard for you to look through to understand when the rights ratchet is being clicked in front of your eyes. Look for indications like, is the project hosted by a non-profit foundation or by a company? Now, being with a foundation is actually no guarantee of your software freedom, but it's much more of a guarantee than a single company with special status hosting the project. Ask yourself how the project was funded. Investors will want their investment back. VCs don't buy companies, they buy exits. And so you have to ask yourself, what is the exit for this company based on who funded it? And is that likely to mean that this is going to turn out to be a rights ratchet? It's very important to look at who owns the trademarks in the project. One of the things a VC will be looking for will be monetizable assets for the company it's invested in. So they'll be asking the company to file trademarks, to file patents, to have a corpus of exclusively owned copyright, because all of those increase the value either when the company exits or in the event that the company tanks. There are at least some patents to sell so that the trolls can go recover the VC's money. Trademarks in particular are worth looking at. A reputable project owned by or operated by a company like Red Hat will have command line switches and build options to guard the trademarks. And we'll look at that in the next slide. You'll want to look at the project license. Don't tolerate anything other than OSI approved licenses. OSI isn't some behemoth imposing its will on the community. OSI is more the lens through which the consensus of what counts as open source is focused on behalf of the community. And so when a project chooses to shun OSI approved licenses, it's usually because they are embarrassed by the fact that the license they do want to use, it doesn't actually give you any freedoms, any software freedoms. Look for a contributor agreement. There's very rarely an excellent reason to have a contributor agreement. The arguments for having one are usually ones that are divertible into rights ratchet progressions. Projects are perfectly able to operate on a license in equals license out basis, where upstream contributions are made under the project's license alone. That's been the way that the Linux kernel has operated. That's the way that PostgreSQL operates. That's the way that GNOME operates. Those projects may well have the DCO or some other certification of identity and originality by the contributors, but they don't aggregate copyright. You need to make sure that the project that you're wanting to use has all the features that are critical to you available as open source software. So see where the dividing line between the open source and the open core versions are. The phrase open core is a very deceptive term. There's really nothing open about open core. The open part is called open source, and the bit that is not open is the bit that you're paying for, the bit that does the business function that you require. And open core is, in my view, a very deceptive term for that reason. And you'll want to check that the project is realistically forkable. Now, when I say realistically forkable, I've got a few hints about what that means. A realistically forkable project is one that will have a public repository that's actually used for live development and is associated with a bug database and probably associated with CI/CD. You'll want to keep a sync copy of both the configuration of the repository and CI/CD and also of the repository itself constantly. And I've been involved in several projects that have been saved by the fact that they not only kept the sync copy, but kept backups of it so they could roll back to the point in history where the license hadn't been changed on the documentation or on the DevOps instructions. Do check the project can be built without trademarks. Another common reason for not being able to fork is because it's too much engineering to take the trademark of the company out of the software. Check it can actually be built. Sometimes these projects rely on elements in the CI that you don't have access to. And keep track of other large users so that when the unfortunate day arrives, you've got colleagues in other companies who might share the cost with you. You can protect yourself by seeing whether the CLA can be avoided. Often your legal department can do good things for you in negotiating with the supplier, particularly if you are a very lucrative target for the company. You may well be able to negotiate license in equals license out instead of license copyright assignment. You may well be able to negotiate other escrow rights. In the end, it's up to you to advocate for permission in advance whenever you are at public conferences related to your software, whenever you're talking to the developers. And I've written a blog post for you that's on the screen here that explains what I mean by permission in advance. It's about protecting and preserving your open source rights, what's sometimes called the four freedoms, and explaining why they are important to you and explaining how they are relevant, not just as ideology, but also as practical everyday liberties to operate your business in the way that you want to do. In the end, you can't always avoid rights ratchet companies. You'll find that you do have to use their software, but be prepared, be ready for that day when they are going to exit and leave you with nothing much to use. So to summarize for you, the rights ratchet is really as old as open source. It's a story old as time, and you'll discover that it's very difficult to avoid rights ratchet projects. For some reason, open source databases are very prone to the rights ratchet model. The clicks along the timeline may prove unavoidable to you, but you can invest in those that don't ratchet too often. More importantly, you can invest in those that don't ratchet at all, because their upstream is at Apache or PostgreSQL or Software Freedom Conservancy or one of the other genuine multi-party open source projects. In the end, rights ratchet is just another factor you have to take in your software acquisition. And I recommend that you keep an eye open for it and that you warn others when you suspect that the rights ratchet may be in operation. Now, I may have said some things you thought were controversial there, so we're going to have a Q&A. If in the end you would prefer to talk to me directly, you're welcome to book a one-on-one through my Clarity account, and I'll be very pleased to have a conversation with you about the rights ratchet model and other aspects of managing your open source project and your upstream relationship with other communities. Thank you very much.